The gun was on the table. Not between them, that would be a threat. It was behind her, on the filing cabinet near the door, her service weapon placed there when she'd entered the interrogation room 11 hours ago. Standard procedure. What was not standard procedure was that Dominic Moretti, son of the most powerful mob boss on the Eastern Seaboard, the man she was supposed to be breaking, was the one who'd noticed she'd been rubbing her shoulder where the holster usually sat. And he'd said, without looking up from the table, "It bothers you. The weight of it. Even when it's not there." Nobody had ever noticed that before. Not her partner. Not her ex-husband. Not the bureau therapist she saw every 6 months and lied to about her stress levels. A man in handcuffs had seen her more clearly in 11 hours than anyone in her life had seen her in 34 years. And that was the moment Special Agent Natasha Reynolds understood she was in trouble. Because 6 hours later, right now, in this room, at 3:47 a.m. on a Saturday morning, Dominic Moretti had just slid a photograph across the metal table. A photograph of a woman Natasha recognized instantly because she saw that face every morning in her bathroom mirror, 25 years older. Her mother, Eleanor Reynolds, standing outside a restaurant on Mulberry Street in 1994, accepting an envelope from a man whose face she also recognized because she'd been building a federal case against him for 8 years. Marco Moretti, Dominic's father. Her mother had known the Morettis. Her mother had taken money from the Morettis. And her mother had never said a word. 6 blocks south, Marco Moretti sat at a mahogany table in the private dining room above his restaurant, a room that smelled of espresso and wood polish and the ghost of his dead wife's perfume, and he was staring at his phone because his firstborn son had been inside a federal building for 11 hours, and the silence was telling him something that 40 years in this life had taught him to recognize. The silence before everything changes. He turned to his consigliera. "Raymond, if my son opens the wrong door in that building, he won't just destroy this family. He'll destroy a woman who doesn't deserve it. A woman whose father he stopped. 40 years of discipline. 40 years of choosing which words leave the room and which ones die in your throat. Get him out, whatever it costs." And 12 floors above the interrogation room, Deputy Director Catherine Hale watched a surveillance feed that had frozen 9 minutes ago and felt the specific chill that comes from knowing your best agent, the one you mentored, fast-tracked, trusted with the biggest case of your career, just went dark in a room with a target who asked for her by name. Here's what none of them knew yet. Dominic Moretti hadn't been arrested by accident. He'd engineered his own capture because 3 weeks ago he'd decoded a secret ledger hidden in his father's safe, a ledger showing 23 years of monthly payments to a woman named Reynolds, Natasha's mother. And buried beneath that ledger was a letter that revealed something worse. Natasha's father hadn't died in a construction accident. He'd been murdered by Dominic's uncle. And both families, the one in badges and the one in silence, had been bound by that blood ever since. This is a story about 2 families who've been destroying each other for 23 years without knowing it. One wears the badge. One wears the ring. And in 72 hours, a single interrogation room is going to crack both of them open. The question isn't whether she'll flip him. The question is what happens when the truth flips them both. Before I take you back to the beginning, before I show you the moment these 2 families collided, I need to know. Where are you right now? What time is it where you are? Drop your city and the time in the comments. Whether you're up at 2 a.m. with your headphones in, or you're listening on your way to work, I want to know who's riding with me tonight. Because this one's going to stay with you long after it's over. Now, let me take you back 72 hours. The rain came sideways on Mulberry Street, the kind of November rain that doesn't fall. It attacks. It turns the old Italian neighborhood into a smeared watercolor of neon and wet asphalt, and it makes the windows of Moretti's restaurant glow like the portholes of a ship at sea. Inside, at the bar, Dominic Moretti sat alone with an espresso that had gone cold 40 minutes ago and a decision that had been burning a hole through his chest for 3 weeks. He was 31, 6'2". His mother's dark Roman eyes, his father's broad Sicilian jaw. The charcoal Tom Ford suit cost more than most people's monthly rent because in this family, you dress like the world was always watching. Because it was. He turned the espresso cup on its saucer, slowly, precisely, and watched the overhead light catch the gold signet ring on his right hand. The Moretti crest. A lion holding a sword. 4 generations of firstborn sons had worn this ring, and every single one of them had done something unforgivable while wearing it. In 8 minutes, he was going to walk outside, get into a car that wasn't his, and drive to a location where federal agents were waiting. He was going to let them arrest him. He was going to let his father believe it was a catastrophe. Because 3 weeks ago, Dominic had cracked open a floor safe in the private dining room upstairs, decoded a ledger his grandfather had encrypted in a prison cell in 1974, and found the receipt for a murder his family had been paying for since before he was born. And the only person who might want the truth as badly as he did was the woman the FBI would assign to break him. The kitchen door swung open. His sister. Valentina was 27, sharp-featured, sharper-tongued, with cropped dark hair and the kind of eyes that cataloged a room the way an accountant catalogs a balance sheet. Every detail weighed, every discrepancy flagged. She ran the restaurant's books. All 3 sets. She set a plate of biscotti beside his cold espresso and leaned against the bar with her arms folded. "You've been sitting here for an hour staring at nothing," she said. "That's Papa's move, not yours." "I'm fine, Val." "You're lying. You always touch food you don't eat when you're lying." She reached over and straightened his tie, a gesture so maternal it cracked something in his chest, because their mother had been dead for 6 years and Valentina had been filling that silence ever since without anyone asking her permission. Her fingers lingered on the knot for half a second longer than necessary. She could feel his pulse through the silk. It was fast. "Whatever it is," she said softly, "don't do it alone." He cupped her face in both hands, kissed her forehead, held it 1 beat too long, long enough that her frown deepened into something close to fear, and then let go. "Lock up tonight, okay? Dom." But he was already walking into the rain. Valentina stood at the bar holding a biscotti she hadn't made for herself and watching the door swing shut, and the dread she'd been feeling all night crystallized into a single thought. He's not coming back. Not the way he left. 5 miles north, on the 12th floor of 26 Federal Plaza, Special Agent Natasha Reynolds was doing the thing she did when cases stalled. She was talking to photographs. Not out loud. She wasn't crazy. But she'd pinned 16 surveillance shots of Moretti family members to a corkboard behind her desk, and she'd been staring at Dominic Moretti's face for 9 minutes, tracing the line of his jaw with her eyes, trying to read something in the grain of the image that the investigation hadn't given her. 9 months of surveillance. Phone taps. Financial subpoenas. And Dominic Moretti remained a ghost, present at family dinners, visible at the restaurant, technically employed by the construction company, but connected to nothing actionable. He was either the cleanest mobster's son in history or the most careful. Natasha was 34. Lean, precise, deep brown skin, close-cropped natural hair, and the kind of controlled stillness that made defense attorneys nervous because they never knew where the knife was coming from. She'd grown up in Newark, raised by a single mother who worked double shifts at University Hospital and deposited an extra $3,000 every month into a savings account she told Natasha not to ask about. Natasha had asked anyway. She'd been asking her whole life. The answers had built a career. Her office door opened without a knock, which meant it was Reyes. Assistant Special Agent in Charge Luis Reyes, 53, compact, silver-templed, the permanently exhausted eyes of a man who'd watched too many cases die in plea deals, stood in her doorway holding his phone like it had bitten him. "We just got a gift." "What kind?" "The kind that drives a stolen vehicle through a federal checkpoint with unregistered guns in the trunk and then sits in the 10th precinct asking, and I'm quoting the desk sergeant here, to speak with Agent Reynolds specifically." Natasha's jacket was halfway on. It stopped. "He asked for me by name." By name. Which means he's either stupid, desperate, or playing a game neither of us can see. AG wants him flipped. 72 hours before his father's lawyers get an emergency hearing. 72 hours to turn the Crown Prince into a cooperating witness. And if I can't, then we lose the biggest RICO case this office has built in 15 years, and you explain to Deputy Director Hale why her press conference just evaporated. Reyes paused at the door. Tasha. Why does Dominic Moretti know your name? She didn't answer. Because the truth, the one she'd been orbiting for 20 years like a planet circling a black hole, was a bankbook she'd found in her mother's dresser at 11 years old with deposits that didn't match a nurse's salary. And a feeling she'd carried into Quantico, into the organized crime task force, into this office and this corkboard and this specific obsession, that the Moretti family wasn't just a case. It was a mirror she was afraid to look into. She grabbed her keys. Let's go get him. The call came at 12:17 a.m. By 12:30, every man who mattered was seated at the mahogany table. The private dining room above Moretti's restaurant existed in a permanent state of amber twilight, wall sconces turned low, heavy curtains blocking the street, the wood absorbing sound so that every conversation felt like a confession. The room smelled the way it always smelled: espresso, old wood, and Maria's perfume, which Marco still had the staff spray on the curtains every Sunday because grief was the one opponent he'd never learned to outmaneuver. Marco Moretti sat at the head. 63 years old. Thick hands that had carried concrete in their 20s and carried decisions ever since. A voice that never rose above a murmur because the quietest man in the room is the one everyone leans toward. He listened to his consigliere, Raymond Ortiz, 58, Cuban-American, bald by choice and blunt by constitution, the only non-Italian to ever sit at this table, explain that his firstborn son had been arrested with stolen property and unregistered firearms and was currently en route to federal custody. The guns aren't ours, said Angelo, from the far end. Angelo Moretti, Marco's younger brother. 59. Thinner, harder, with the quick eyes of a man who saw betrayal in every room because he'd committed enough of it to know the angles. Angelo had survived 40 years in this life not by being strong but by being first to see the threat, first to act, first to eliminate. He was wearing a silk shirt that cost $600 and an expression that Marco had learned to read 30 years ago, controlled panic disguised as analysis. The car isn't ours, Angelo continued. None of this connects to us. It's a setup, or the kid did something stupid. Either way, the lawyers handle it. Marco looked at the empty chair to his right. Dominic's chair. 5 years of his son sitting there, learning the weight of inheritance. Learning how power moves through a room like weather, invisible until it hits you. Who did he ask for? Marco said. The table went quiet. Special Agent Natasha Reynolds, Ray said. Organized Crime Task Force. Marco closed his eyes. 1 heartbeat. 2. When he opened them, Angelo, a man who had once stared down a shotgun in Bensonhurst without flinching, shifted in his seat. Everyone out. Except Ray. Angelo opened his mouth. Marco raised 1 finger. Angelo left. When the door closed, the room contracted to 2 men and the truth between them. He found the ledger, Marco said. Ray's hand, reaching for espresso, froze in the air. Raymond. My father invented that cipher in a cell in Ossining. It took him 9 months. My son cracked it in 2 weeks. And now he's sitting in a federal building asking for a woman whose family I've been paying since before she was born. Paying for what, Marco? Ray's voice was careful now. 30 years of friendship balanced against the thing his friend had never told him. You said it was restitution. A debt. You never told me the details. Because the details would have made you an accessory. Marco stood and walked to the window. Mulberry Street was empty below, slick with rain, the restaurant's awning dripping a slow rhythm onto the sidewalk. In June of 1994, a man named David Reynolds fell 9 stories on a Moretti construction site in Newark. Scaffolding failure. I was 29. I'd been running the construction arm for 3 years, and I was cutting corners because cutting corners is how you turn a profit when your margins are already going to the family. Falsified inspection reports. My orders. His death was the consequence. And the payments. $3,000 a month to Eleanor Reynolds, his widow, for 23 years. Routed through 4 intermediaries so the trail dies in the middle. Enough to keep her above water. Enough to make sure their daughter had what she needed. The minimum. Nowhere close to enough. Ray leaned forward. And the daughter became an FBI agent. The daughter became the FBI agent who's been building a case against this family for 8 years. And she has no idea. She has never had any idea. And if my son opens his mouth in that interrogation room, it's not a RICO case anymore. It's a corruption scandal. It reaches into the bureau itself. And it destroys her. Marco's voice cracked.
Hairline.
Almost inaudible. But Ray had known him for 30 years, and he heard it the way a structural engineer hears a fracture in a support beam. It destroys a woman who has done nothing wrong, whose only crime is being the daughter of a man I killed through negligence and greed. I've been carrying that weight for 23 years, Raymond. I will not let my son pass it to her. Then let me get him out before he... You have 72 hours. Before the lawyers get a hearing. 72 hours to bring my son home before he opens a door that buries us all. Nobody told Angelo to go home. That was a mistake. Angelo Moretti sat in his Cadillac in the alley behind the restaurant, engine idling, rain hammering the roof, and made a phone call that Marco didn't know about, to a man Marco didn't know existed, about a problem Marco didn't fully understand. Because Marco, for all his power, all his careful silence, all his decades of calculated control, didn't know the real story of David Reynolds. He knew a version of it. The version Angelo had given him in 1994, negligence, an accident, cut corners. That version had been eating Marco alive for 23 years, which was useful because a guilty Marco was a controllable Marco. A Marco who believed he owed a debt was a Marco who wouldn't ask too many questions about how that debt was managed. The truth was worse. The truth was that David Reynolds hadn't died because of bad scaffolding. He died because he'd been working late on a Tuesday night in June and had walked into the wrong part of the site at the wrong time and had seen Angelo Moretti put 2 bullets into a man named Carmine Luca, an associate who'd been skimming and needed to disappear. Reynolds had seen it. He'd run. He'd made it 3 blocks before Angelo's people picked him up, drove him back to the site, and staged the scaffolding collapse. A construction accident.
Clean.
Except that Angelo's foreman, Joseph DeBello, had written a letter detailing everything and hidden it in Marco's safe as insurance, and now, 23 years later, Marco's son had found it. Angelo's phone connected. "It's me." The kid found DeBello's letter. He's in federal custody, and he's talking to the Reynolds woman. A pause on the other end. "Then we have a problem. We have a problem I need solved in 72 hours. Before Monday morning. Before the kid hands them a murder charge with my name on it." Another pause. "What are you asking me to do?" Angelo stared through the rain-streaked windshield at the restaurant's back door. The door his brother walked through every morning. The door their father had walked through before him. The door to a kingdom Angelo had spent his entire life protecting while Marco got to sit at the head of the table and be loved. "I'm asking you to make sure that letter never sees a courtroom. Whatever it takes." He hung up, started driving. The rain hammered the windshield as he merged onto the Belt Parkway, heading toward a meeting that nobody at the mahogany table would ever know about. Angelo had built a life in the spaces between what the family saw and what actually happened. He'd kept the machinery running. He'd handled the things Marco was too principled or too sentimental to handle. And he'd done it without credit, without the chair at the head of the table, without the love that the family poured onto Marco, like he was the only one who deserved it. Angelo didn't resent his brother. Resentment implied surprise, and Angelo had never been surprised by the family's preference for Marco. Marco was warm. Marco was steady. Marco was the kind of leader people followed because they wanted to, not because they had to. Angelo understood his own role. He was the reason Marco could afford to be warm. He was the cold that kept the predators away. And if that meant carrying secrets, making calls in parking lots, arranging things that would horrify the brother he loved, then that was the price. And Angelo had always been willing to pay prices that other people found unacceptable. But this price, this one, the final one, might be the one that broke even him. And the rain kept coming. Natasha had been in the room for 2 hours, and Dominic Moretti hadn't behaved like a single person she'd ever interrogated. She'd opened with the standard approach, the surveillance photos, the gun charges, the implication of a RICO case waiting in the wings. She'd laid it out cleanly, professionally, the way she'd done 200 times before. And Dominic had listened with the patient attention of a man watching someone solve the wrong equation. When she finished, he said, "You're good at this. The pacing, the way you build the pressure, it's almost musical. But you're working the wrong case." "Excuse me? The guns in the trunk aren't mine. The car isn't mine. You'll verify that by Monday, and I'll walk. We both know this. So let's skip the part where you pretend you have leverage and I pretend I'm scared, and let's talk about why I'm actually here." Natasha set her pen down. Not because she was rattled. She'd been spoken to with far more aggression by far less articulate men, but because his tone wasn't defiant. It was collaborative, as if he'd come here to work with her. And that wrongness, the absence of fear, the absence of hostility, set off every alarm she had.
"Fine."
"Why are you here, Mr. Moretti?" "I told the desk sergeant I'd only speak to you." "I'm aware." "Why me?" "Because 3 weeks ago I decoded a ledger my father keeps in a floor safe. A ledger showing 23 years of monthly payments to your family. And I need to understand why." The room changed. Not physically. Same concrete walls, same bolted table, same buzzing fluorescent. But the air between them shifted the way air shifts before a storm, and Natasha felt something she hadn't felt in an interrogation room since her first week at Quantico, the ground moving under her feet.
She didn't show it.
15 years of discipline held her face in place. But her heart rate spiked. She could feel it in her wrists, her throat, the backs of her knees, and Dominic noticed. Not the spike itself. He noticed the effort of concealing it. The way her breathing stayed, perfectly even when it should have changed. The micro-tension in her jaw that said control rather than calm. "You didn't know," he said quietly. "Not a question. An observation. I'm conducting this interview, Mr. Moretti."
"Dominic."
"If we're going to talk about why my father has been paying your mother $3,000 a month for 23 years, we should probably use first names." Natasha stared at him. And for the first time in her career, she reached behind her and turned off the recording. The red light on the camera died. The room went absolutely silent. And Dominic Moretti, who had gambled his freedom, his family, and his safety on the theory that this woman wanted the truth as badly as he did, watched her face and saw the moment she decided to stop being an agent and start being a daughter.
"Talk," she said.
Valentina couldn't sleep. The dread had roots now. It had burrowed down past intuition into certainty, the way it does when you've grown up in a family that runs on secrets and you've developed a sixth sense for the ones that are about to surface. She was in the restaurant kitchen, rolling pasta. Fold, press, turn. Her mother's rhythm, her mother's recipe, her mother's kitchen. The one room in the Moretti empire that Maria had claimed as her own, where the rules of the family didn't apply and the truth was whatever came out of the oven. Maria Moretti had died of pancreatic cancer at 54, and in the 6 years since, Valentina had watched this family hollow out from the inside, her father turning to marble, Angelo turning to paranoia, Dominic turning into a man who carried secrets the way their mother had carried rosary beads, always, silently, with a grip that left marks. The kitchen door opened. Angelo. Her uncle moved like something between a man and a blade, angular, efficient, the economy of motion that comes from decades of being the person in the room who acts while everyone else deliberates. He poured espresso, leaned against the counter, and watched her roll dough with an expression Valentina couldn't read, which scared her because she could usually read everyone. "Your brother got himself arrested." Fold, press, turn. "I know." "Your father cleared the room. Only Ray stayed." Her hand stopped. In this family, clearing the room was a 5-alarm fire. She'd seen it twice in her life. Both times, the family had changed shape afterward. "What's Dom into, Val?" She looked at her uncle. Calculated. Valentina had learned from her mother that the most dangerous thing a woman in this family could do was show a man everything she knew. You show them enough to seem honest. You keep the rest. "I don't know what he's into, Uncle Angelo. He doesn't tell me things. You run the books. You see money move. I run the restaurant books. Papa's other arrangements are above my clearance." Angelo studied her. She let him. She kept her hands in the dough and her face in the flour and waited until he finished his espresso, set the cup down with surgical precision, and left. Then she opened her laptop. Because Valentina had lied. She knew about the payments, not from Dominic, but from the books themselves. $3,000 a month, routed through the restaurant's maintenance account, to an address in Newark. 23 years. She'd found it 18 months ago and said nothing because in this family, the person who finds the secret becomes responsible for it, and Valentina already carried enough responsibility for 3 lifetimes. But there was a second stream she'd noticed more recently. $800 a month.
Different shell company.
Different name, J. DeBello Trust. Routed through Angelo's personal accounts. 2 families being paid. One through Marco. One through Angelo. 2 debts from the same year. Valentina looked at the kitchen door where Angelo had stood and felt something cold settle in her stomach. Because the only scenario that explained both payment streams was one where her father and her uncle were guilty of different things related to the same event, and both had been buying silence ever since. She picked up her phone, called her Aunt Gianna, her mother's sister, who lived in Astoria and had never said a kind word about Angelo Moretti in her life.
Zia.
I need the truth about 1994. About David Reynolds. Silence on the other end. Then Gianna's voice, old and heavy, and carrying something she'd held for 23 years. Your mother made me swear, Valentina. On the Madonna. Mama's gone. And Dom is in a federal building right now about to find out on his own. I'd rather hear it from family. A long, long pause. The sound of Gianna's kitchen clock, the ceramic one with the cats, the one Maria used to tease her about. David Reynolds wasn't killed by bad scaffolding. He was killed because he saw your uncle Angelo murder a man on the construction site. Angelo staged the collapse to cover it. And your father didn't know until after. He found out too late. So he did the only thing he could. He took care of the family Angelo destroyed. He's been carrying Angelo's sin for 23 years. And it's been eating him alive. Valentina set the phone down, stared at the pasta dough, and made a decision that was going to split the Moretti family in half. Now let me ask you something. And be honest, whose side are you on right now? The FBI agent whose entire life might be a life funded by mob money? The mob boss's son who got himself locked up to find the truth? Or the sister who just found out her uncle is a murderer? Drop it in the comments. I want to see where this audience stands. Because this story doesn't have good guys. Just people making impossible choices. The surveillance camera had been off for 2 hours. Natasha knew this was career-ending. She also knew that what Dominic had laid on the table, a decoded page from Marco's ledger, a timeline of payments matching her mother's secret deposits to the dollar, was the answer to a question she'd been asking since she was 11 years old. E. Reynolds, she said. That's my mother, Eleanor. I know. These payments started 3 months after my father died. September 1994. Your father died in June. The gap is the time it took to build the routing for intermediaries, shell companies, blind transfers. Designed so the trail dies in the middle. That's not guilt money. Natasha's voice was steady, but her fingers had curled around the edge of the table. If your father felt bad about a construction accident, he'd send cash in an envelope. I've seen it 100 times. This architecture, this is a contract. This is an obligation. The word hung between them. Contract. Not charity. Not restitution. Something with terms and consequences. My mother never spent it, Natasha said.
Not a dime.
23 years of deposits, all sitting in a savings account in Newark. $847,000. She left it to me when she died. I haven't touched it either. Why not? Natasha looked at him, really looked, past the Tom Ford and the signet ring, past the composure that mirrored her own so precisely it was almost eerie, and let him see something she hadn't shown anyone. The exhaustion of a 20-year question. Because I always knew it was a lie. She told me it was from my father's family. Support money. But my father was a construction worker from Irvington. His people had nothing. I found the bank book when I was 11, and I've been chasing the truth ever since.
It's why I'm in the FBI.
It's why I'm in organized crime. It's why I'm in this room. You've been circling my family your whole career. I've been circling a question my whole career. Your family just happens to be standing in the middle of it. Dominic reached into his jacket slowly, aware of the implications of sudden movements even with the camera off, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Yellowed.
Aged.
Creased from being carried close to the body. This was in the safe with the ledger. A letter. Dated August 1994. Written by a man named Joseph DeBello. Natasha's breath caught. DeBello. Every organized crime investigator in the Northeast knew that name. Marco's construction foreman in the 90s. The man who ran every site, signed every inspection. Died in 1997. Heart attack. Officially. DeBello would have been responsible for the scaffolding on the site where my father died. Read the letter. She unfolded it. The handwriting was cramped, urgent. A man writing fast, writing scared. She read it once. Her hands didn't shake. She read it twice. The room tilted. The letter didn't describe an accident. It described a murder. Angelo Moretti had killed a man named Carmine Luca on the construction site. David Reynolds, working late, wrong place, wrong time, had witnessed it. 3 days later, the scaffolding collapsed. DeBello had written it all down as insurance. A dead man's switch hidden in a safe, waiting 23 years to detonate. Natasha pressed her palms flat against the metal table. Grounding. The technique they teach at Quantico for moments when reality shifts beneath you and you need something solid. But there was nothing solid anymore. Her father hadn't died in an accident. He'd been murdered. By the uncle of the man sitting across from her. And the monthly payments, her mother's secret, her childhood mystery, the invisible engine that had driven her entire career, weren't restitution for negligence. They were blood money. The price of silence for a killing that had been disguised as a construction accident for 23 years.
Dominic.
Yes. Your uncle murdered my father. Yes. And your father has been paying my family to keep it buried. My father thought it was an accident. He believed for 23 years that he was paying for his own negligence. The DeBello letter proves it was Angelo. My father was carrying the guilt for a crime his brother committed. How do you know your father didn't know? Because I know my father. And because a man who knew it was murder wouldn't have let the killer sit at his table for 23 years. You're asking me to trust your read on a mob boss. I'm asking you to consider that my father might be the one person in this story who's been lied to even more than you. The silence stretched. Two people on opposite sides of an uncrossable line, staring at each other through the wreckage of everything they'd thought they knew. Why bring this to me? Natasha's voice was barely above a whisper now. You could have gone to the police, the press, another agency. Because you're the only person in the world who wants the truth about David Reynolds as much as I do. And because he stopped. Something shifted in his face, the composure cracking for the first time, showing something raw underneath. Because I've spent 3 weeks reading about your career. Every case, every conviction, every time you sat across from a man like my father and took his family apart. And I realized you've been fighting the same war your whole life without knowing why. You built yourself into a weapon against families like mine. And the reason the thing driving you was us. It was always us. That's not. Your father died on a Moretti site. Your mother took Moretti money. You became the FBI's best organized crime agent. That's not coincidence, Natasha. That's gravity. And I think you've felt it pulling you toward this room for 20 years. She didn't answer. Because he was right. She'd known it in her bones since the first time she'd pinned a Moretti surveillance photo to her corkboard and felt something beyond professional interest, something personal, something magnetic, something that whispered closer, closer. The answer is closer than you think. And now the answer was sitting across from her in a Tom Ford suit, wearing a signet ring from the family that killed her father, asking her to trust him. Catherine Hale did not tolerate silence from her agents. 57, silver-haired, with the bearing of a woman who'd broken glass ceilings by being twice as prepared and 3 times as relentless as the men around her. She'd risen through the bureau during an era when women in law enforcement were expected to be grateful. She was not grateful. She was furious. The AG wanted a press conference. The media had been primed. And her best agent had been off camera for 5 hours. Reyes stood in front of her desk, sweating. She turned off the recording at 3:52 a.m. No audio or visual synths. And you didn't intervene. Protocol gives the lead agent. Protocol gives her discretion to adjust recording methods. Not to disappear into a black hole with a target who asked for her by name. Hale stood. Reyes stepped back. I want that camera restored. I want eyes on that room. And I want to know why Dominic Moretti knows who Natasha Reynolds is. She walked to her window. Manhattan shimmered in the morning light like a city that had nothing to hide, which was a lie. The whole city was built on things people buried and forgot. Something was wrong with this case. She could feel it the way she felt shifts in political weather, not through evidence but through the absence of evidence, through the silence where there should be noise. Hale had recruited Natasha Reynolds 8 years ago, plucking her from a field office in Newark where she'd been running routine financial crimes investigations and placing her on the organized crime task force because Hale had recognized something in the younger agent, a hunger that went beyond ambition, a specific, bone-deep drive that Hale had seen in her own mirror 30 years earlier. The drive of a person who wasn't just building a career, but searching for something, chasing something, running toward an answer that the work itself couldn't quite provide. Hale had always assumed the hunger was dedication, the particular fire the best agents carry, the ones who feel each case as a moral reckoning rather than a professional exercise. She'd built her mentorship of Reynolds on that assumption. Now, with her best agent off camera for 5 hours and a target who'd asked for her by name, Hale was reconsidering. The hunger might not be dedication. It might be personal. And personal, in the Bureau, was a hairline fracture in a load-bearing wall.
You don't always see it.
But the building knows. She picked up her phone and dialed a contact at the DOJ she hadn't spoken to in 3 years. It's Hale. I need a sealed records search on one of my agents. Natasha Reynolds. Everything juvenile, family, financial. All of it. The contact hesitated. Sealed record searches on active agents were career grenades, the kind of action that, if it went wrong, destroyed both the investigator and the investigated. Catherine, you're certain about this? I'm certain that my best agent has been off camera with a target for 5 hours, that the target asked for her by name, and that in 30 years of doing this, I've never seen a mob family's heir request a specific agent without a reason that should keep all of us up at night. Run it. 14 hours in. Someone had brought sandwiches. They sat untouched. What was happening in interrogation room 4B had stopped being an interrogation around hour 4 and had become something else, something that didn't have a name in the Bureau's procedural manual. 2 people with different halves of the same broken story sitting across a metal table, building the picture together. She had the FBI's surveillance records. He had the decoded ledger and the DeBello letter. She knew the Reynolds side. The bank book, the deposits, her mother's silence, the death certificate that said accidental. He knew the Moretti side, the payments, the routing, the floor safe, the cipher. Together, in the clinical glow of the fluorescent lights, they assembled 23 years of lies into something approaching truth. But it was the small things, the things that had nothing to do with evidence or investigation, that were becoming dangerous. At hour 6, Natasha had rubbed her shoulder where the holster usually sat, and Dominic had said, without looking up, "It bothers you. The weight of it. Even when it's not there." And she'd frozen. Because nobody noticed that. It was the smallest tell she had, an unconscious habit, a ghost sensation, the body remembering a weight the mind had set aside. And he'd seen it. At hour 9, she'd mentioned that her mother made Trinidadian black cake every Christmas, Eleanor's one tradition from her own mother, passed down through generations of women who measured love in flour and rum. Dominic had said, "My mother made struffoli." Same idea. Recipes are how families remember who they were before everything got complicated. And Natasha had felt something shift in her chest that had nothing to do with the case. At hour 11, they'd argued about the morality of the payments, whether Marco's money was atonement or control, whether accepting it made Eleanor complicit or pragmatic, whether children can inherit guilt they didn't earn. The argument was heated, honest, and Natasha realized halfway through that she was arguing with Dominic Moretti the way she argued with people she respected, without pulling punches, without performing, without the careful distance she maintained with everyone else in her life. She was being herself. In a federal interrogation room, with a mob boss's son. That was the moment she understood what was happening. Not romance, not yet, maybe not ever, but something that precedes romance and is in some ways more frightening. Recognition. The experience of being seen by someone who shares your damage from the opposite direction. Two people standing on different sides of the same wound, looking at each other, and realizing that the thing they'd been searching for wasn't answers. It was a witness. Now, at hour 14, the DeBello letter between them and the full scope of Angelo's crime laid bare, Natasha said the thing she'd been circling for 3 hours. If this comes out, if anyone discovers that my family received payments from the Moretti organization for 23 years, it doesn't matter that I didn't know. Every case I've built, every warrant I've signed, every conviction I've secured becomes tainted. I'm the compromised agent, the one who was bought and didn't know it. You'll lose everything you built. I'll lose the person I built. The agent. The investigator. The woman who spent 15 years being the opposite of what that money represents.
She paused.
Do you understand what that means? I became who I am because of your family, both the good and the bad. The money that kept me housed and fed and educated, your family. The rage that drove me into the FBI, your family. I'm a product of the Morettis, whether I want to be or not.
So am I, Dominic said.
The difference is I've always known it and you just found out. They looked at each other across the table. 14 hours and 23 years. What do you want, Dominic? She asked. Not what your father wants. Not what the Bureau wants.
You.
I want my uncle to answer for your father. I want my father to stop carrying a lie. I want the truth to exist somewhere outside this room without destroying you.
He paused.
And I want to know if it's possible for two people on opposite sides of something that's broken to build something that isn't. That's a lot of wants for a man in federal custody. I'm an optimist. It's a character flaw. She almost smiled. Almost. And the almost was more intimate than a full smile would have been because it meant she was fighting it, and the fight meant it mattered. Can I tell you something? He said. You've been telling me things for 14 hours. Something that isn't about the case. He leaned forward, not aggressively, not strategically, but with the tentative lean of a person approaching something fragile. When you talk about your mother, your voice changes. Not the pitch, the texture. It gets rougher. Like the words have to push past something to get out. And when you talk about your career, the cases you've built, the convictions, your voice goes smooth. Precise. Like a blade. Two completely different people in the same voice. You've been profiling me. I've been listening to you. There's a difference. Profiling is looking for weaknesses. Listening is looking for the person. And what person do you see? Someone who built an entire identity out of opposition. Someone who defined herself as the anti-Moretti, the one who takes these families apart, without knowing that she was built by a Moretti. And now that she knows, she's sitting in this room trying to figure out if there's a version of herself that exists without the opposition, without the enemy, without the fight. The fluorescent light buzzed through a full cycle. That mechanical heartbeat. You're remarkably perceptive for someone in handcuffs. They took the handcuffs off 6 hours ago. I know. I was testing whether you'd correct me. Why? Because a man who corrects a detail like that is paying attention to the reality of the room, not the power dynamic. Which means you're not performing. Which means everything you've said to me tonight is real. Now it was Dominic's turn to be seen. The feeling was disorienting, like standing in a spotlight you didn't know was aimed at you. Natasha Reynolds had spent 15 years reading people in rooms like this, and she'd just read him with the casual precision of a surgeon making an incision, so clean the patient doesn't feel it until later. You're terrifying, he said. I get that a lot. I mean it as a compliment. I know. That's what makes it interesting. They sat in the silence again, but it was a different silence now. Not the silence of secrets. Not the silence of calculation. The silence of two people who've crossed into a territory that doesn't have rules yet, where neither of them knows the choreography, where every word is both a step forward and a risk. Thursday, Natasha said suddenly.
What?
When this is over, when the case is resolved, when IA clears me, when your father's cooperation is documented and your uncle is facing charges, there's a coffee shop on Sullivan Street. I go there on Thursdays. Is that an invitation? It's an observation. What you do with observations is up to you. Thursday. Thursday. And in that word, shared across a metal table at 2 a.m. in a federal interrogation room, between an FBI agent and a mob boss's son, between a woman whose father was murdered and the nephew of the man who killed him, there was something that neither the Bureau nor the Moretti family had a protocol for. Something that existed outside the case files and the ledgers and the 23 years of blood money. Something private. Something chosen. Something that started with a day of the week and might, if the world was kinder than either of them had any reason to believe, become something more. Ray Ortiz had called 4 defense attorneys, 2 federal contacts, and a judge. None of it mattered, because Dominic wasn't trying to get out, a fact Ray communicated to Marco in the study at the Pelham Bay compound with the delicacy of a man defusing a device he'd built himself. He's not asking for a lawyer. He's not invoking rights. He's talking, Marco. Voluntarily. For 18 hours. Marco stood at the window. Long Island Sound was gray under afternoon clouds, and the water had the flat, metallic look it gets in November. The look of something that has stopped pretending to be beautiful and is just being what it is. Marco understood the feeling. He'd been standing at this window for 40 years, watching the water change with the seasons, and he'd always thought of the Sound as a mirror for the family, sometimes bright, sometimes dark, always moving. Now it looked still, like something that had stopped.
He's talking to her, Marco said.
To Reynolds, yes. He's telling her about the payments. Almost certainly. And the letter. Ray went still. The particular stillness of a man who's been standing near an explosion he didn't know was possible. What letter? Marco turned from the window. The morning light was behind him, throwing his shadow long across the study floor, across the Persian rug Maria had chosen, across the desk where 4 generations of decisions had been made, across the distance between the man he'd been at 29 and the man he was at 63. Joseph DeBello wrote a letter before he died. A confession. Everything, Carmine Luca, Reynolds, the scaffolding. He hid it in my safe, and I found it 3 weeks ago because my son had moved it, trying to cover his tracks after he decoded the ledger. Dominic is smart, Raymond. But he's not as careful as he thinks. Marco's voice was flat, controlled. The voice of a man describing his own autopsy. The letter says that David Reynolds wasn't killed by negligence. He was murdered. The scaffolding was deliberately sabotaged. By whom? Angelo. The mantel clock ticked. Maria's clock, the one she'd found at an estate sale in Westport, the one she'd placed there because she'd insisted the study needed something beautiful in it, something that measured time gently rather than just counting it. The letter describes Angelo executing Carmine Luca on the construction site. Marco continued. David Reynolds, working late, wrong place, wrong moment, witnessed the killing. 3 days later, the scaffolding collapsed. And my brother came to me and said there'd been an accident. Negligence. Our negligence. And I believed him. 23 years. Ray's voice sounded like a man discovering that the floor he'd been standing on was painted over a hole. You thought it was your corners cut, your scaffolding inspections, your guilt. My brother sat across this table from me for 23 years, knowing the truth. He ate my food. He drank my wine. He held my children. He watched Maria get sick. He held her hand in the hospital, Raymond, and he knew. He knew the weight I was carrying was his weight.
His sin.
And he let me carry it because a guilty man is a useful man. A guilty man pays what he owes and keeps his eyes down and never looks too closely at the people around him because he's too busy looking at himself. Angelo understood that. He used my conscience as a containment strategy, and it worked for 23 years. Marco's voice didn't break. It did something worse. It went flat, emptied of the careful modulation that had defined it for 4 decades, stripped to its foundation. And the foundation was grief, so old it had fossilized. "What are you going to do?" Ray asked. Marco looked at the photograph on the mantel. Maria, laughing, her hand on Dominic's shoulder, the light in her hair. She'd known.
He was certain of it now.
Gianna would have told her, because sisters don't keep the worst secrets from each other, and Maria had stayed anyway. Stayed because leaving meant losing everything she'd built, everything she loved, the life that existed in the spaces between the crimes. She'd stayed and she'd carried it, and she'd gotten sick and she died with the words still in her throat. "I'm going to let my son do what I should have done 23 years ago. I'm going to let him tell the truth. And when the FBI comes for me, and they will come, Raymond, I'm going to open the front door myself." Ray leaned back in the armchair, closed his eyes, and for the first time in 30 years of friendship, Marco heard his consigliera say something that wasn't strategic, wasn't calculated, wasn't filtered through the lens of legal risk. "Good. It's time." Stories like this, about blood and family, and the lies we carry for the people we love, they don't tell themselves. If you want to know how this ends, if you want to see whether these 2 families survive what's coming, hit subscribe. That's how we keep these stories alive. One tap. Because what happens in the next 48 hours is going to change everything for both families. At 7:15 p.m., Natasha walked out of the interrogation room and told Hale everything. She told it in a 12th floor conference room with no cameras, the city glowing through the windows like a theater set. She told it the way she'd been trained, chronological, precise, clinical. And then she told Hale the thing she'd never told anyone. 3 days before Eleanor Reynolds died, she'd surfaced from the morphine with sudden, startling clarity. Natasha had been holding her hand in the hospice room in Newark when Eleanor's eyes focused, and she said, "Baby, I need to tell you about your father." Natasha had leaned in, heart hammering, and the morphine had pulled Eleanor under. She never woke up. She died carrying whatever she'd been about to say, and Natasha had spent 4 years since imagining what those words would have been. Now she knew. Her mother had been trying to tell her that David Reynolds was murdered, that the money was blood money, that the family Natasha had spent her career fighting had been the family keeping them alive. Eleanor had carried that truth for 23 years, alone, and in the end the weight of it had outlasted her body. Hale listened to all of it. Then she said, "You should have told me about the money the moment you discovered it." "I know. You should have recused yourself. I know. But you didn't. Because you were looking for the same answer your mother died trying to give you." "Yes." Hale stood and walked to the window. What Natasha couldn't see, what nobody in the Bureau would ever know unless Hale chose to tell them, was the calculation happening behind that silver-haired composure. Because Deputy Director Catherine Hale had a phone call she hadn't made yet. The Attorney General had been promised a press conference. A RICO cooperation deal. The biggest organized crime takedown since Gravano. And Hale had been the one who'd promised it, had staked her professional credibility on delivering Dominic Moretti as a cooperating witness. The AG trusted Hale because Hale had spent 30 years earning that trust, brick by brick, case by case, never once overpromising, never once failing to deliver. If Hale called the AG and said, "The cooperation deal is dead, but we have a murder charge instead," that was manageable. A pivot. The AG could work with a murder charge. But if Hale called the AG and said, "The cooperation deal is dead, the murder charge is complicated by the fact that my lead agent has been unknowingly receiving payments from the target family for 23 years, and I need you to protect her career instead of using her as a sacrificial headline," that was a different conversation entirely. That was the kind of conversation that ended deputy directorships. Because the AG wouldn't see a tragedy. The AG would see a story. FBI agent connected to mob family for decades. The AG would see a press conference that was even bigger than the one they'd planned. Not a cooperation deal, but a corruption scandal. The kind of headline that launches political careers. And if Hale protected Natasha, truly protected her, not just from the charges but from the narrative, it would cost Hale the AG's trust. It might cost her the appointment she'd been working toward for 3 years. It would certainly cost her the political capital she'd been banking for the next election cycle. Hale stood at the window and waited. 23 years of an agent's career against her own ambitions. The right thing against the strategic thing. And for the first time in a very long time, the two didn't align. She turned back to Natasha. I'm going to tell you what's about to happen, and then I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do about it. The AG is expecting a press conference. When I cancel it, he's going to want a reason. When I give him the reason, the payments, your connection to the Morettis, his first instinct is going to be to burn you. Not because he's cruel. Because the corruption angle is a bigger story than the cooperation deal, and bigger stories serve bigger ambitions. Natasha's face didn't change, but her hands, flat on the table, pressed harder. I'm not going to let that happen, Hale said. But you need to understand what it's going to cost me. I'm going to spend every piece of political capital I've built in 30 years protecting an agent who technically violated 6 bureau protocols tonight. The AG is going to ask why. And I'm going to tell him it's because you're the best investigator I've ever trained, and because the bureau doesn't punish agents for being victims of crimes they didn't know about. And then the AG is going to decide whether my judgment is worth more than his headline, and honestly, Natasha, I don't know which way that goes. Ma'am, I'm not finished. Hale's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, a current, like water moving under ice. Whatever is happening between you and the Moretti kid in that room, I'm not asking today. But I will. And when I do, the answer better be something I can defend, because I'm about to put myself between you and a political machine that will grind us both to dust if it decides we're not useful. Natasha looked at the woman who'd recruited her, mentored her, fast-tracked her career, and who was now standing in a 12th floor conference room preparing to sacrifice her own ambitions to protect someone else's integrity. This was not the calculation of a bureaucrat. This was a choice. A human choice, made at human cost. Thank you, Natasha said. Don't thank me.
Give me something I can work with.
The DeBello letter. Angelo. A murder charge big enough to make the AG forget he ever wanted a cooperation deal. I can do that. Then let's move. Hale made 3 calls. The first killed the AG's press conference, and Natasha could hear, through the closed door, the controlled fury in the AG's response, the sound of a political relationship cracking under the weight of principle. The second opened an internal affairs assessment, not of Natasha, but of the payment structure, establishing the paper trail that would prove her ignorance. The third was to a federal judge, requesting an emergency warrant. Not for Dominic Moretti. For Angelo Moretti. Murder. Conspiracy. 23 years of obstruction. And while those calls were being made, 2 things happened simultaneously. At 7:38 p.m., a man named Victor Sosa, a private security contractor Angelo had used for 12 years, a man whose skill set included document retrieval, evidence tampering, and the kind of targeted arson that insurance companies classify as electrical fault, pulled into the parking lot of the FBI's evidence processing facility in Brooklyn. He had a work order forged by Angelo's contact inside the NYPD Records Division, a set of credentials that would pass a routine check, and instructions to locate and destroy a letter dated August 1994, currently logged as evidence in a pending federal investigation. The plan was clean. Angelo had designed it in the Cadillac 3 hours earlier, the way he designed everything, methodically, accounting for every variable except the one he'd never learned to account for. That someone in his own family might be faster. At 7:45 p.m., 7 minutes after Sosa parked in Brooklyn, Valentina Moretti walked into the lobby of 26 Federal Plaza in Manhattan, carrying a flash drive. She asked for Agent Reyes by name. She said 6 words, "I have evidence against my uncle." Reyes, rumpled, exhausted, having the worst day of his career, led her to the 10th floor. And within 40 minutes, Valentina's financial records had corroborated the DeBello letter so thoroughly that the original document was no longer the linchpin of the case. Angelo's 20 years of payments to the DeBello Trust, documented, routed, time-stamped in Valentina's meticulous accounting, told the same story from the money side. Even if every physical copy of the letter burned, the numbers would still testify. At 8:22 p.m., Victor Sosa was stopped at the evidence facility's security checkpoint when his forged work order flagged an internal alert, an alert that hadn't existed 3 hours earlier, triggered by Hale's emergency warrant, which had placed every piece of Moretti-related evidence under federal seal. Sosa was detained. He said nothing. He'd been paid enough to say nothing. But the failed breach was logged, and when the FBI traced the forged credentials back through Angelo's NYPD contact, it added a conspiracy charge to the warrant that was already being drafted. Angelo didn't know any of this. Angelo was eating veal at a restaurant in Gravesend, checking his phone every 4 minutes for a confirmation text from Sosa, a text that would never come. At 9:47 p.m., when federal agents walked through the restaurant door, Angelo's first thought wasn't about the charges or the evidence or the years he was facing. His first thought was, Sosa didn't text. His second thought was, someone beat me. He looked at the agents, looked at the ceiling, and said one word, Marco, because in Angelo's mind, it was always Marco. Every failure, every loss, every moment where the world refused to bend to Angelo's will, the explanation was always his brother. Too principled, too loved, too willing to sacrifice the hard things for the sake of being good. Angelo had spent 60 years protecting Marco from the consequences of his own goodness. And now Marco's children, the boy Angelo had taught to drive, the girl Angelo had watched grow from a baby into the sharpest mind at the table, had used that goodness as a weapon. He didn't resist. There was nothing left to resist with. The letter was sealed. The money was traced. The plan had failed. And the thing Angelo had always known, in the basement of his calculating mind, that the architecture of deception has a shelf life, that every lie is a loan against a future you can't control, had finally come due. Two Morettis had walked into Federal Plaza voluntarily that night. Neither had been flipped. Both had chosen truth over blood, independently, at their own cost, because both had decided that the sins of the previous generation couldn't be inherited again. And in a restaurant in Brooklyn, the man who'd created those sins sat in handcuffs and understood, for the first time, that the family he'd spent his life protecting had finally protected itself. From him. What the FBI didn't see, what the case file would never capture, was the 14-minute drive. Valentina drove to Manhattan with the flash drive in her coat pocket and the windows down because the cold air kept her sharp and she needed to be sharp for what she was about to do. 14 minutes to cross the line between loyalty to the family and loyalty to the truth. She spent the entire drive arguing with her mother. Not literally. Maria Moretti had been dead for 6 years. But Valentina had been having conversations with her mother's ghost since the funeral, at the stove, at the books, in the quiet moments between obligations when the restaurant was empty and the kitchen was hers, and tonight's conversation was the hardest one yet.
You knew, Mama.
You knew what Angelo did. You stayed anyway.
Why?
The answer came in Maria's voice, the way it always did. Warm, practical, the voice of a woman who'd married into this family with open eyes and spent 30 years navigating its moral geography like a cartographer mapping a flood zone. Because leaving would have meant losing your father. And your father, for all his sins, for all the weight he carries, is a good man trapped in a bad world. I stayed to make sure his goodness survived. I stayed for you and Dominic. And Angelo? You let him sit at the table. You served him dinner. You let him kiss your children. I let a lot of things happen that I'm not proud of, Valentina. That's what it means to be a woman in this family. You swallow the things you can't change, and you protect the things you can. I protected you. I protected Dominic. I couldn't protect David Reynolds, and I've had to live with that. You're dead, Mama. You don't have to live with anything anymore.
No.
Now you do. Valentina parked. Sat in the car for 2 minutes with her hands on the wheel, breathing. Then she picked up the flash drive, got out, and walked through the glass doors of 26 Federal Plaza, 7 minutes ahead of a man in Brooklyn who was trying to destroy the evidence she was about to hand over. She didn't know about Victor Sosa. She didn't know about the race. She only knew that her mother had spent 30 years swallowing truths that should have been spoken, and that the swallowing had turned to cancer, and that Valentina was not going to die the same way. Now I need to hear from you. What would you have done in Marco's place? Your brother murdered an innocent man and let you carry the guilt for 23 years. Do you turn him in? Do you handle it the old way, privately in silence, the way families like this have always handled it? There's no clean answer. That's the whole point. Drop yours in the comments. The clock expired at 2:15 a.m. Monday. But the case had already transformed. Angelo was in custody. Marco had signed cooperation agreements at his kitchen table at 11 p.m. Sunday night. Valentina stood in the doorway of the study and watched her father put his name on documents that would reshape the family forever, his hand steady, his face carved from the same stone as the house itself, showing nothing except, in the faintest tremble of his jaw, the relief of a man setting down a weight he'd carried so long he'd forgotten what his body felt like without it. When Marco finished signing, he looked up at Valentina. Father and daughter. The mahogany desk between them, covered in federal documents. The mantel clock ticking its patient, relentless count. Your mother would have been proud of you, he said. Mama would have done this 20 years ago.
Yes.
She would have. She was always braver than me. He set down the pen. Valentina, the restaurant is yours. Not because I'm giving it to you, because it's always been yours. Your mother built it. You kept it alive. The name on the deed was mine, but the soul of that place is Maria's, and you're the one she passed it to. Valentina stepped into the study, sat in the chair across from her father. The chair where Ray usually sat, the chair for the consigliera, the trusted advisor, the keeper of the family's conscience. She sat there, and she didn't cry, because Moretti women don't cry in rooms where business is done. They cry later, alone, in kitchens that smell like their mother's sauce.
Papa.
I need to ask you something. Ask. Did you love him? Angelo. Despite everything, did you love him? Marco was quiet for a long time. The clock ticked. The house settled around them the way old houses do, creaking and sighing as if the walls themselves are exhaling. He was my brother, Marco said. Loving him was never a choice. It was a condition. Like breathing. Like gravity. You don't decide to love your brother. You just do, and then you spend your whole life figuring out what that love costs. He looked at the documents on his desk. The cost was David Reynolds. The cost was Eleanor Reynolds spending 30 years alone. The cost was a daughter who grew up without a father and became an FBI agent trying to fill the hole he left. The cost was your mother knowing the truth and dying without being able to speak it. That is what my love for Angelo cost. And I will carry that accounting for the rest of my life. Valentina reached across the desk and took her father's hand. Thick fingers. Calloused palms. The hands that had carried her when she was small, that had steadied her bicycle, that had gripped Maria's hospital bed rail until the knuckles went white and the monitors went flat. Hands that had signed checks to a dead man's widow for 23 years. We carry it together now, she said. Marco squeezed her hand.
Once. Hard.
And that was the Moretti version of weeping, a single moment of contact that said everything the words couldn't hold. Dominic walked out of Federal Plaza at 3 a.m. Monday morning, into air that was cold and clear and smelled like nothing. Not espresso, not old wood, not fluorescent lights, just the raw, neutral scent of a New York City night in November. He stood on the sidewalk and breathed. 72 hours. He'd walked in as Marco Moretti's heir, carrying a ring and a name and the assumption that he understood what both meant. He was walking out as something else. Something he didn't have a word for yet. A man who'd dismantled his own family to save it. A man who'd spent 3 days in a room with a woman who was, by every institutional measure, his enemy, and who had become, by every human measure, the only person in the world who understood the shape of his grief. His phone buzzed. A text from Valentina. I'm at Plaza. Gave them the flash drive. Angelo is done. Come home. He typed back, home soon.
Thank you, Val.
Then he opened a new message. Typed a number he'd memorized 14 hours ago, when Natasha had written it on the corner of her legal pad and slid it across the table with a look that said, "This is not professional, and I don't care." Sullivan Street. Thursday. 3 p.m. You said, not yet. Is Thursday close enough? 3 minutes. 3 minutes of standing on a sidewalk in Lower Manhattan, watching his phone, feeling like the 23-year-old version of himself, nervous, hopeful, not yet hardened by the family business into the careful strategist he'd become. 3 minutes of being just a man who'd met a woman and wanted to see her again. Then, don't wear the Tom Ford. He smiled, stood on the sidewalk smiling like an idiot at 3 a.m. and didn't care who saw. Dominic didn't go to the compound first. He went to his apartment, showered, slept for 9 hours, and woke at 2 p.m. feeling like a man who'd been disassembled and put back together with the pieces in slightly different positions. Everything worked. Nothing fit the way it used to. He drove to Pelham Bay at 5:30. The compound looked the same, the stone walls, the bare November garden, the front door, but it felt different. Like returning to a childhood bedroom and discovering it's smaller than memory made it. The house hadn't changed. He had. Marco opened the door himself. He always did. But the way he looked at Dominic was new, not the careful, evaluating look of the patriarch assessing his heir, but something raw. The look of a man seeing his son clearly for the first time, which also meant seeing himself clearly, and finding both images painful. They went to the study. Marco sat behind his desk. Dominic sat in the chair across from him. Not Ray's consigliere chair, but the other one, the smaller one, the one he'd sat in as a teenager when Marco lectured him about responsibility and legacy and the weight of the Moretti name. The room smelled the same: leather, lemon oil, and the faintest trace of Maria's perfume from the curtains. The mantel clock ticked its patient count. For a full minute, neither of them spoke. Then Dominic said, "I need to hear you say it." Marco's hands were folded on the desk. The thick fingers. The gold ring. Not the signet ring, the wedding band, the one he'd never taken off. "Say what?" "That you didn't know. That Angelo told you it was an accident, and you believed him." "I need to hear you say it, Papa, because I sat in a federal building for 72 hours carrying the theory that you didn't know, and I staked everything, my freedom, that woman's career, this family's future, on that theory being correct. And now I need to know if I was right." Marco looked at his son. 31 years old. The suit wrinkled from 3 days of wear, the jaw shadowed with stubble, the dark eyes, Maria's eyes, carrying a weight they hadn't carried a week ago. This was the moment. The one Marco had been dreading since he'd read the DeBello letter and understood what Angelo had done. Not the FBI. Not the charges. Not the legal consequences.
This.
His son, sitting across the desk, asking, "Are you who I thought you were?"
"I didn't know," Marco said.
"Angelo came to me in June of 1994 and said there'd been an accident. A worker fell. Scaffolding failure. He said it was our negligence. Our inspections, our corners cut. I believed him because it was plausible. We were cutting corners. I was young and arrogant, and I care more about profit margins than the men standing on my scaffolding. So when Angelo said a man died because of our negligence, I believed it because I deserved to believe it. The guilt was true even if the story wasn't. You paid the widow for 23 years. I paid because a man died on my site and his family deserved better than what the legal system would give them. I paid because looking at that bank book every month, seeing the transfer go through, was the closest thing I had to penance. I didn't know it was blood money, Dominic. I thought it was guilt money. There is a difference. A small one. But it mattered to me." Dominic leaned forward. "And the woman the money went to, her daughter. You knew she became FBI." "I knew. You knew she was building a case against this family." "Yes. And you never told me. You never warned me. You let me sit at that table upstairs and plan the family's future without knowing that the FBI's best agent had a personal connection to us that could detonate everything. I was protecting you. You were protecting yourself." The words landed hard. Marco flinched, not visibly, but in the way his hands tightened around each other on the desk, the knuckles whitening for a single beat before he controlled it. "Yes," he said. "I was protecting myself. From having this exact conversation. From seeing this exact look on your face. Because I knew, I have always known, that the day you found out, you would look at me the way you're looking at me now. Like I'm smaller than you thought I was." The clock ticked. The sound was so familiar it was almost invisible, the background hum of every important conversation this room had ever held. You're not smaller, Papa. Dominic's voice was quiet. The anger had passed through him and left something else behind, something sadder but more durable. Understanding. You're exactly the size you always were. I'm just seeing all of it now. The good parts and the rest. Marco's jaw worked. The Moretti jaw, the one Dominic had inherited, the one that clenched when the heart was full and the mouth couldn't hold it all. Your mother would have told you years ago. She wanted to. Gianna told me, after. Maria wanted to tell you everything. Why didn't she? Because I asked her not to. Because I told her I'd handle it. Because handling things, controlling the flow of truth, deciding who knows what and when is the only skill I've ever truly mastered. And it is, I'm realizing, the skill that has done the most damage. Dominic stood, walked to the mantel, looked at the photograph, the one of all three of them laughing, the one from the dinner where Angelo had told a joke that made Maria spit wine. A happy family. A true image of a false peace. I met someone, Dominic said. Marco was quiet. In the interrogation room. The Reynolds woman. He stopped. Searched for the word. She's like us. She carries things. She doesn't know how to set them down. Is that wise? Given the circumstances? Nothing about any of this is wise, Papa. But she saw me. Not the suit, not the name, not the ring.
Me.
And I'm not going to pretend that doesn't matter, because it's inconvenient. Marco looked at his son standing at the mantel, standing exactly where Maria used to stand when she was making a point, one hand resting on the wood, the other in her pocket, the posture of someone planting a flag, and felt something shift between them. The hierarchy, patriarch and heir, teacher and student, the careful vertical architecture of the Moretti family, tilted, leveled. For the first time, they were standing on the same ground. Bring her to dinner, Marco said. Papa. When the time is right, when the legal matters are settled, bring her to dinner. She should know this table. Dominic looked at his father. 63 years old. Tired in a way that went past the physical into something structural, the exhaustion of a man whose foundations have shifted and who's learning to stand on new ground. But standing. Still standing. I will, Dominic said. They didn't embrace. Moretti men don't embrace in studies. That's for doorways, for arrivals and departures, for the moments when the body admits what the mouth can't. But Marco reached across the desk and gripped Dominic's hand, hard, brief, with the specific pressure of a man transferring something. Not power. Not authority.
Trust.
The trust of a father who's just watched his son outgrow him and is choosing, against every instinct of ego and control, to be grateful for it. What nobody tells you about doing the right thing is that the aftermath feels nothing like the decision. The decision is clean, a single moment, a line crossed, a door opened. The aftermath is months of standing in the cold on the other side of that door, waiting for the world to rearrange itself around what you've done. For Natasha, the hard weeks were the 6 weeks of IA review. She reported to the bureau every morning, sat at her desk, and was not allowed to work cases. Not suspended, reassigned to administrative review, which was the bureau's way of putting you in a glass box and letting everyone watch while they decided whether to break you. Her colleagues were careful around her. Not hostile, careful. The careful politeness of people who don't know if you're a hero or a liability and are waiting for someone with more authority to tell them. She ate lunch alone. She drove home alone. She sat in her apartment in the evenings and stared at the savings account statement and felt the specific loneliness of a person who's told the truth and is waiting to find out if the truth is enough. Dominic called on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Always at 8 p.m. Always from a block number, because the legal situation made direct contact complicated and neither of them wanted to create evidence that a defense attorney could weaponize. The calls were short, 10 minutes, 15, but they were the scaffolding that held her weeks together. He told her about the restaurant. She told him about the silence at her desk. He told her Valentina had started making their mother's recipes and it was making Marco cry, which was either healing or devastating depending on the day. She told him she'd started running in the mornings because the physical exhaustion was the only thing that quieted the noise in her head. What noise? He asked. The noise of not knowing who I am when I'm not working a case. You're the woman on the other end of this phone. That's who you are right now. That's not an identity. It's a start. For Marco, the hard weeks were the Sundays. The family still gathered, smaller, the table echoing with Angelo's absence like a room with a wall missing, and Marco sat at the head and poured wine, and served food, and performed the rituals of a patriarch presiding over a family that had voluntarily amputated a limb. Ray came every Sunday. Valentina cooked. Dominic showed up with wine and a look on his face that Marco recognized because he'd worn it himself in 1994. The look of a man carrying a new secret, a good one this time, one that made him lighter instead of heavier. For Valentina, the hard weeks were the ones where she rebuilt the books. All of them. She shut down every shell company, closed every blind account, unwound 20 years of Angelo's financial architecture with the systematic precision of a woman dismantling a bomb. The legitimate money, the restaurant, the property holdings, the investments that had never touched criminal proceeds, she kept. Everything else, she reported. The forensic accountants at the FBI told her she was the most cooperative witness they'd ever worked with. She told them she wasn't cooperating. She was cleaning. The trial lasted 11 days. The courtroom was packed every morning, reporters, law students, retired prosecutors, and a handful of men from the old neighborhood who sat in the back row and watched with the expressionless attention of people who understood that what was happening on the stand was also happening to their world, to the code of silence that had governed their lives, to the assumption that family loyalty trumps everything, even truth. Dominic testified on day 3 in the charcoal Tom Ford, not for show, but because it was the suit he'd been wearing when the truth started, and he was sentimental enough to believe that clothes carry their own kind of honesty. He sat in the witness box and described the ledger, the cipher, the decoded payments, the DeBello letter. He described arranging his own arrest. He described 72 hours in an interrogation room with a woman he'd gone in planning to use as a means to an end and had come out wanting to protect. When the defense attorney, a man Angelo had employed for 20 years, a man who'd eaten dinner at the Moretti table, who'd bounced Dominic on his knee as a child, asked why Dominic had chosen to betray his own family, Dominic looked at Angelo across the courtroom. His uncle was sitting perfectly still, hands folded, the angular face composed into an expression of studied indifference that Dominic recognized because he'd seen it his whole life. Angelo's mask, the one he wore when he was calculating, always calculating, measuring distances and threats, and the shortest path to survival. But his eyes were different. Beneath the mask, in the dark stillness of Angelo's eyes, Dominic saw something he'd never seen before, the recognition that the calculation had failed, that there was no angle left to play, that the nephew he'd taught to drive was now the man driving the nail into his coffin. "I didn't betray my family," Dominic said. "My uncle betrayed David Reynolds. Then he betrayed my father by making him carry the guilt for 23 years. The only betrayal in this courtroom happened in 1994. The courtroom was silent. Angelo looked at his hands. Marco testified on day 7. 3 hours on the stand. The gallery leaned forward collectively, the way an audience leans into a performance that has gone beyond entertainment into something more, testimony in the religious sense, a man bearing witness to his own failures. Marco Moretti, a man who had spent 40 years speaking in murmurs and governing through silence, spoke clearly and fully, and without reservation. He described the construction operation, the corners cut, the falsified inspections, the phone call from Angelo saying there'd been an accident, the arrangements, the payments, the intermediaries, 23 years of monthly transfers to a woman he'd never met. And then, in a voice that the court reporter would later describe as the quietest sound she'd ever had to transcribe, he described the moment 3 weeks ago when he'd read the DeBello letter and understood that his brother had not only murdered an innocent man, but had weaponized Marco's own guilt to keep the secret buried. "I believed for 23 years that I killed David Reynolds," Marco said. "Through my negligence, my greed, my failure to maintain safe conditions on a site I was responsible for. And that belief, that guilt, defined every decision I made, every payment I sent, every night I lay awake. My brother let me carry that because a guilty man doesn't ask questions. A guilty man pays what he owes and keeps his head down. Angelo used my conscience as a prison, and I served 23 years in it. The prosecution rested on day 10. Valentina's financial records had been entered as evidence on day 9. Meticulous, devastating, the paper trail of a family's sins rendered in debits and credits. She didn't testify. Her records spoke for themselves. But she was in the courtroom every day, second row behind the prosecution, dressed in black. Not mourning Angelo. Mourning the family that had existed before the truth. The version where Sunday dinners were just Sunday dinners and Uncle Angelo was just Uncle Angelo and nobody's hands were stained with anything worse than marinara sauce. That family was dead. What survived was smaller, scarred, and, for the first time in Valentina's lifetime, real. Angelo was convicted on all counts: murder in the first degree, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and sentenced to life without parole. He showed no emotion when the judge read the sentence. But as the marshals led him from the courtroom, he passed the second row where his family sat: Marco, Dominic, Valentina, Ray Ortiz, and he stopped. The marshals tensed. The courtroom held its breath. Angelo looked at Marco. 60 years of brotherhood passed between them in that look. The fights in the yard as children. The first job they'd worked together. The night their father died, and they'd sat in the hospital corridor sharing a flask of whiskey. The morning Angelo had held Dominic as a newborn and said, "This one's going to be trouble." The decades of dinners and deals and the slow, invisible poisoning of a relationship that might have been beautiful if Angelo hadn't decided that protecting the family required becoming the thing the family should have been protected from. "I did it for us," Angelo said. Quietly. Barely audible. The court reporter caught it, but only just. Marco didn't respond. He watched his brother be led away. And when the courtroom door closed and Angelo was gone, truly gone, permanently gone, removed from the table and the room and the family with the finality of a brick wall, Marco pressed his palms flat on his knees and breathed. One breath.
Two.
The steady, measured breathing of a man who has lost something essential and is teaching himself, in real time, to live without it. Valentina put her hand on his arm. Dominic sat on his other side, close enough that their shoulders touched. Ray Ortiz sat behind them, silent, present, the consigliera doing what a consigliera does in the worst moment, bearing witness. And the four of them sat in a courtroom that was emptying around them and let the silence hold what the words couldn't. Marco got a suspended sentence. 5 years probation. He closed the construction company the following week, walked through the offices one last time, touched the desk his father had bought in 1962, locked the door, and handed the key to Ray. "Done," he said. One word. The end of an era compressed into a syllable. He kept the restaurant because the restaurant was Maria's and Valentina's and the one part of the Moretti empire that had never been tainted by anything worse than too much garlic. Natasha was cleared by Internal Affairs in March, after a review process that lasted 6 weeks and involved 3 interviews, a forensic accounting analysis of the Reynolds savings account, and a formal assessment that concluded, in the dispassionate language of bureaucratic absolution, that Agent Reynolds had no knowledge of or complicity in the financial arrangements established by Marco Moretti for the benefit of the Reynolds family. Her cases were preserved.
Her career was intact.
The words, "integrity confirmed," appeared on a document that she put in a drawer and never looked at again because the Bureau's opinion of her integrity mattered less to her than her own. She took the $847,000 and spent 3 months building the David Reynolds Memorial Fund. Safety equipment for construction workers. Legal advocacy for workplace accident victims. Whistleblower protection for employees who reported code violations. Every dollar that had once purchased silence now purchased the opposite: the ability to speak, to report, to refuse to look the other way. David Reynolds had died because he'd seen something and someone had decided that his seeing was a threat. His daughter was making sure that seeing, witnessing, speaking, refusing silence was no longer something that cost people their lives. The fund's first grant went to a construction site safety program in Newark, 3 blocks from the hospital where Eleanor had worked double shifts. 6 blocks from the apartment where Natasha had grown up finding bank books she wasn't supposed to see. The check was delivered to the site foreman by Natasha personally on a Tuesday afternoon in April, and she stood on the sidewalk afterward looking up at the scaffolding, solid, inspected, safe, held together by bolts and regulation and the specific, unglamorous infrastructure of giving a damn about the people who work at dangerous heights. She thought about her father. Not the ghost of him, not the absence, not the sealed record, not the blood money, but the man. David Reynolds. 31 years old when he died. Construction worker. Father of a 3-year-old daughter he would never watch grow up. He'd had calloused hands and a bad knee and a laugh that carried, according to the few co-workers Natasha had tracked down during the investigation, like a bell across the construction site. She didn't remember the laugh. She'd been too young. But she remembered the shape he'd left, the dad-sized hole in every room, the way her mother stiffened when construction scenes came on television, the Christmas mornings that were always slightly too quiet, as if someone had turned the volume down on the holiday and nobody could find the remote. She stood on the sidewalk in Newark and looked up at the scaffolding and said, quietly, to no one and to everyone, "This is what it was for, Dad. This is what the money becomes." A construction worker on the 3rd level looked down, saw a well-dressed woman talking to the sky, shrugged, and went back to work. That was fine. She didn't need anyone to hear it. She just needed to say it, to complete the circuit between a death in 1994 and a purpose in the present. To take the thing that had been broken and bend it into something useful. Not whole. Broken things don't become whole. But useful. Forward-facing.
Alive.
She walked to her car, sat in the driver's seat for a moment, and checked her phone for a message she already knew would be there. Still Thursday? Still Thursday. And on a Thursday afternoon in May, in a coffee shop on Sullivan Street, Dominic Moretti showed up in the Tom Ford anyway. Natasha laughed. A real laugh. The kind that starts in surprise and ends in warmth and makes everyone in the room turn to look, because genuine joy is rare enough to be worth noticing. They ordered coffee. Hers black. His espresso, because old habits are a language, and some languages you don't want to unlearn. They sat by a window where the late afternoon light fell golden across the table, and they talked for 3 hours. Not about the case. Not about the trial. Not about the families or the ledgers or the 23 years of blood money.
About books.
She loved Baldwin. Giovanni's room had cracked her open at 19, and she'd never fully put herself back together. He loved Calvino. If on a winter's night a traveler had taught him that stories don't need endings to be true. They both loved Le Caire, which led to a 20-minute debate about whether espionage fiction was really about betrayal or about the impossibility of knowing another person completely, and by the end of it they were both leaning forward with the specific intensity of 2 people discovering that someone else's mind moves the way theirs does. About terrible movies they secretly loved. Dominic confessed to an unironic attachment to a particular Nicolas Cage film that Natasha found so absurd she nearly choked on her coffee. She admitted to watching courtroom dramas for the procedural errors, pausing them to point out inaccuracies to her empty living room. "That's the most endearing thing I've ever heard," he said. "Endearing is what men say when they want to say weird but are too polite," she said. He laughed. She noticed that his laugh, unlike his speaking voice, which was careful and measured, was ungoverned.
Loud.
The laugh of a boy who hadn't yet learned to be a Moretti. She liked it. About whether pineapple belongs on pizza, a debate that escalated to the point where the barista weighed in. 2 other customers moved their chairs closer, and Dominic was making an impassioned case involving the history of Hawaiian pizza and the cultural imperialism of Italian food purists, while Natasha countered with a forensic analysis of flavor profiles that sounded like she was presenting evidence to a grand jury. The barista sided with Natasha. Dominic accepted defeat with a graciousness that told her more about his character than 72 hours of interrogation ever had. About fear. This came later, when the coffee was cold and the light was shifting and the conversation had reached the depth where casual topics give way to the ones that matter. He told her he was afraid of becoming his father. Not the criminal parts, but the silent parts. The parts that carry weight until the carrying becomes the whole identity. She told him she was afraid of the opposite, of having nothing to carry, of the investigation ending and the mission completing and the question being answered, and discovering that without the fight, she didn't know who she was. "You're the woman who turned blood money into safety equipment," he said. "That's not a fight. That's a purpose. There's a difference." And somewhere in the third hour, when the light had shifted from gold to amber and the conversation had reached that rare, quiet place where two people stop performing and just exist in each other's company, Natasha said, "You were right. What you said in the interrogation room. About gravity." "Which part?" "The part about being pulled toward something your whole life without knowing why. I always thought it was rage. The anger at what happened to my father, even before I knew what really happened. I thought rage was the engine. And now I think it was this. Not rage. Not vengeance. Just this. Sitting across from someone who knows the whole story and isn't running from it." Dominic looked at her across the table, the coffee cups between them instead of evidence files, sunlight instead of fluorescence, Thursday afternoon instead of 3 a.m. Saturday, and said, "For what it's worth, I think your mother would have liked knowing it led here." Natasha's eyes burned. She didn't cry. But she didn't hide the burning either, which was its own kind of breakthrough, letting someone see the wound without performing strength over it.
"Yeah," she said.
"I think she would have." The Moretti restaurant still stands on Mulberry Street. The mahogany table in the private dining room is polished every evening. Marco sits at the head. Dominic sits to his right. Valentina sits where Maria used to sit, because someone has to hold the center of this family, and she's decided it might as well be someone who can actually cook. On Sundays, the family gathers. Smaller now.
Scarred.
But honest, for the first time in decades, honest. And the food is still good, and the wine still pours, and the past sits underneath everything the way the past always does. Invisible, load-bearing, never fully resolved. Angelo Moretti is in Otisville Federal Prison. He does not receive visitors. In a savings account that no longer exists, $847,000 has become the David Reynolds Memorial Fund. Every dollar that once bought silence now buys safety harnesses, legal representation, whistleblower protection. David Reynolds would not have understood the symmetry, but his daughter does. And on Thursday afternoons, every Thursday without exception, two people meet in a coffee shop on Sullivan Street. He always wears the Tom Ford. She always orders black coffee. And they always sit by the window, in the golden light, building something that doesn't have a name yet. Something that started in a concrete room with a metal table and a letter from a dead man. Something that neither family planned for. Something alive. That's where this chapter ends. But you and I both know, nothing ever really ends. Not in this world. Marco's cooperation has an expiration date, and old habits run deeper than plea agreements. Dominic is free, but freedom for Moretti carries a weight that doesn't lift because a judge says so. Valentina is building something clean, but the money she's building with has a history that doesn't wash. Angelo is alive in a cell with nothing to do but plan. And somewhere in a coffee shop on Sullivan Street, an FBI agent and a mob boss's son are falling for each other. And falling is the right word, because neither of them can see the bottom. The end is never the end. Not for families like these. If you want to be here when the next chapter drops, subscribe. Every subscription keeps these stories alive. And trust me, what happens next between the Reynolds family and the Morettis is going to change everything you think you know about loyalty, justice, and the price of love. I'll see you in the next one. Where are you watching from? What time is it?
Drop it below.
I want to know who rode with me tonight.